I'm an American urbanist. My field is city planning, urban history, architecture. And when I first went to the Middle East and I began to look at the cities of the area, I knew they were absolutely wonderful and they were quite different, that each one had its own nature and personality. And I began to read primarily the works of French Orientalists, because they were the classic works on the Islamic city. And they told me exactly what to expect. And I never found them until I began to work on North Africa. And I began to work in those cities that were preserved, presumably, by the French colonial administration. And I suddenly realized that all of the descriptions of the Islamic city were generated by French colonial civil servants who were looking at one or two cities and generalizing to a whole genre of cities. The descriptions applied to that moment of French occupation, which had crystallized and formulated a French ideology of the city, which they were then going to preserve. So that all of these descriptions, which were supposed to refer to the Middle Ages, to the classical city, to the city built by Islam, I suddenly realized were cities that the French had strengthened the walls around, had incarcerated almost a Disneyland image of Islam and the Islamic city, that they had rebuilt parts, and that they had, according to a formula, which was part ideology and part their romantic image of a city.
Religious buildings have always been seen by civilizations as symbolic of that civilization, both within and outside that civilization. So when the famous mosque at Cordoba was captured by the Christians in Spain, it was very deliberately, very symbolically converted into a church, and that point was got across by removing the pillars inside, the arches inside, by closing the courtyard outside. And of course, not everyone was happy. I believe the king of Spain who visited Cordoba was horrified at what the priests had done and said so. He said that you've taken one of the most extraordinary buildings of the world and made it into this monstrosity. Now, a similar development took place, but in the opposite direction, both geographically and religiously, in Istanbul, in Constantinople, when Muslims captured it in the 15th century and converted the church, the famous church, St. Sophia, Justinian's church, into a mosque. The Muslims, of course, were very careful. They didn't destroy anything. They preserved most things, including the paintings of Jesus Christ and Mary, which are now very visible on the ceilings. They were simply plastered over, but not destroyed or defaced. So again, that became a great symbol of Islamic conquest, of the Islamic presence in Europe, and was seen as such. It became a metaphor for Renaissance Islam. In our century, we have the famous example of Ayodhya in India. Ayodhya is a small town not too far from Delhi, and there was supposed to have been a mosque built by the Mughals. They call it Babri Mosque because they say the Mughal Emperor Babur built it, but in fact it was probably built by one of his governors. Now, many Hindus believe that this is where the Lord Ram was born, and the Lord Ram is, of course, one of the most respected figures in the Hindu hierarchy, and they wished for the mosque to be demolished and a temple built, or as they would say, rebuilt for Ram. And this became a great political issue in India. It eventually fed into the passions of the 1980s. It became a political movement and resulted in the destruction of the mosque in December 1992. The destruction triggered off a great many things in India. There were widespread riots all over the land, as far as Bombay and Surat, and some terrible things took place involving killing and raping Muslims. People were involved in the passions on both sides, and communication seems to have been broken between the two communities, which was a great tragedy because India had tried very hard to build a fabric of a multicultural, multi-religious faith. So Ayodhya became the symbol. It became this almost disused structure, a disused mosque, became the symbol of Islam to the Muslims and of Hinduism to the Hindus.
Ever since the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims have tended to express those grievances in religious terms. The government that does not serve their purposes, that does not meet their purposes and try efficiently to solve their problems are considered a government against the laws of God, and that it is religiously right to fight against it and topple it.
We are in the Ibn Tulun Mosque. Does this place for you represent theocratic pluralism or theocratic singularity?
Well, no, I'm afraid it represents neither. For me, it's a monument, not theocratic, religious. And religious in the sense of disregarding any particular or specific creeds, Muslim, Christian, old pharaonic, whatever. But in the sense of a sort of deep, ingrained human experience that is probably shared by quite a lot of people who do care about what we call the grand questions. What is death? What is life? What is destiny? What is God? And so on and so forth. This sort of, what is love? Finally, what is justice in the world? Therefore, it is not theocratic at all. I wouldn't say theocratic, but I would say religious in that sense.
I think actually a lot of what's been written about the City of the Dead is slightly off target. I mean, one has heard figures for the number of people living there bandied around. Some people say that there are 400,000 people living there, but in fact I think the actual number living in the tombs is much smaller. I think what's actually happened with the City of the Dead is that there was a cemetery which was once on the edge of Cairo, and what's really happened is that Cairo has grown and grown beyond the tombs, so that whereas the tombs once marked the edge of the city has spread far to the other side of the tombs, and people have infiltrated into the tombs. But the tombs, even when they were first built in the Middle Ages, they were already occupants, and many of the structures there were built not as tombs but as monasteries or institutions that always had functionaries and people living there. So,
do you mean inside the tombs themselves, right beside?
Yes, right beside the tombs. I mean, a lot of the grandest tombs were designed as monasteries for dervishes, for example, where as they were kind of pious foundations where the wealthy general in the army who built the place would have supplied food and a sort of stipend for dervishes to live there and to perform certain rituals while there. So,
is there a connection between Sufism and this process of living there? Or is it not quite so sophisticated as all that?
It's not quite so sophisticated as all that, and it certainly isn't anymore. When a lot of the biggest tombs were built in the first place, there was a strong connection between Sufism and the building of the original tombs. But that's no longer the case. I mean, the people who live there now are simple Cairenes. Some of them have lived there for generations. Others have moved there because their houses have collapsed. I mean, there's an enormous number every year of houses that collapse, not just because of earthquakes, but just by the accelerated rate of decay that the city lives with in any case.
The exhibitions of the late 19th century were massive public events. They were like the Disney worlds of their day, even on a bigger scale. Millions and millions came to see in these exhibitions representations of every country in the world. They were a way for ordinary Europeans to, so they thought, experience a sense of what the world out there that was rapidly coming under the control of colonial powers looked like, felt like, smelt like. To organize the exhibits, natives were brought in from a number of from a number of non-European countries, from Egypt, from the rest of North Africa, from India, from the Far East, and these natives were put on exhibit for Europeans to look at, examine, talk about, and so on. In this sort of way, the World Exhibitions provided a set of images that made the colonial world, the world that Europeans were colonizing or about to colonize, made it available, made it something that people could talk about, made it something that people could, so they thought, experience directly.
Post-modernism as an idea and as a concept has had a very bad press, particularly from the left, from the Marxists, because in a sense the postmodernist is saying that there are no more ideological structures or frames anymore, and so everything is open for grab and for reassessment and for rethinking. Now, how does Islam figure in all this? I believe that in my book I tried to raise this particular question to point out that it is a crucial time for both Islam and non-Muslim societies, and this crucial point is really afforded by the nature of postmodernism itself, which has all kinds of very interesting ingredients in it. One of them being the very nature of the media, what we are doing, which allows people all over the world to be in communication with one another, which allows the juxtaposition of very different images, which allows access to information as never before in history, and then allows them globally, genuinely, democratically, for millions and millions of people. So while there are many areas of conflict and misunderstanding, there's also great potential in our world because of postmodernist developments, particularly what is called globalization. This is one characteristic of postmodernity, the globalization of technology, of transport, of the media, of the VCR, satellite television, and so on. So this allows a communication which was not possible earlier. You have a good example in the Muslims living in the West. Today there are almost 15 million Muslims living in the USA and the UK. And it's because of this media that they are able to communicate their point of view and in turn, through the media, learn about the societies in the West in which they live.
They built an image of what they considered to be an unchanging, medieval, non-modern, exotic, romantic place.
Why did they do this? Why was this a central preoccupation? Was it an intellectual preoccupation, or was it a preoccupation that helped to grease the wheels of imperialism at the time?
I think it's both. One reads in their work a romanticism of the type that we find very much common in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, of a romanticism about the Middle East, which on the one hand is supposed to be very beautiful and to be morally decadent. The largest body of descriptions of the Islamic city come with the French occupation of Morocco. Most of them are based on the city of Fez as the prototypical, not so much Algiers or the Kasbah, because they, in this period of defining French civilization as opposed to this wonderful Islamic civilization, the distinction was that we don't want to mix the two. We would like to have Moroccans within their own cities and we French will be within our own cities. Our ways of life don't mesh, and therefore we will wall it as a special, I think of it almost as an animal preserve, a zoo.
The emergence of the Muslims in the West, so many in America and so many in the USA and Europe, I think will have long-term implications both for Islam and the West. They are here not with any design, they are not here as part of a global design on the part of Islam. They happen to be here because there was colonization in South Asia, so many drifted to Britain, many from North Africa drifted to France, many from Turkey to Germany because of the historical relations over the last century or two. But what has happened is that these communities are now organizing, there's a new generation coming of age, they're better educated than the previous generation, they're well off, they are assertive, they want to make themselves known, and I believe that over the future they will be playing a significant part in the societies in which they're living, particularly because they are conscious of their role as ambassadors from the Muslim world. And since there's a lot of interest in Islam, these communities are able to interpret, to explain Islam to their host societies.
There were the older Medinas, and next to the older Medinas, the French built Ville Nouvelle for French. I happen to have studied this one, particularly in Morocco, so I'm going to take my examples mostly from there. I was very interested in how the French managed to separate their lives from the Moroccans, to live parallel lives. The ideology of the Islamic city was that it was a unit which mustn't be disturbed, that there must be two separate societies that live apart. And that was the concept of the Islamic city as this very special place whose walls must be strengthened, whose people must be kept in. And as the more I worked, the more I realized that this is not a system of equal respect, but was essentially a method for exploitation.
Well, there are two distinct kinds of tombs. There are the ones that are actually registered as Islamic monuments, as monuments of art, and those are looked after by the government and the government's antiquities organization. But then there are other tombs which are simply private family tombs, and some of them have fallen into decay, and others are looked after by guardians, sometimes people who are paid by the families to look after them, and other times they're simply people who are squatters in the tombs.
Yeah, Ibn Tulun was what can be called the viceroy of the Caliph in Baghdad, but in fact he did rule Egypt in all aspects independently of the Caliphate in Baghdad. That was one, that was an independent or semi-independent, almost quasi-independent Egypt under the nominal rule of the caliphs in Baghdad. And Ibn Tulun, like so many viceroys, a Muslim ruler who who wanted, like most of these viceroys, to immortalize himself and to leave a hallmark. He did, I suppose. Not only himself, but I would give tribute to the people who built this, not who ordered it to be built.
President Mubarak is capitalizing on the fear on the part of intellectuals and Copts to gain their support and gain a sort of legitimacy, the legitimacy the regime has lost years ago. He has been telling the people for years now you can see the threat facing you and you would better support me or else. And In some measure, it is effective with a certain kind of people who fear very much the rising tide of fundamentalism and would have none of it anyway. And so they give their vote to Mubarak, thinking that he is the only alternative to a fundamentalist regime. I know many Copts who voted for Mubarak without being exactly in love with him, just because they fear fundamentalism.
The exhibitions were constructed according to a very clear principle. Europeans, Northern Europeans, the people who built the exhibits, were there as the observers, as, if you like, the masters of the world that was represented in the exhibition. People from the Third World were there to be put on display. They were exhibits to be looked at, to be experienced, and no more. What I talk about at the beginning of my book is where the visit of a number of Egyptians to one of these world exhibitions. This visit was a sort of dislocating experience because they were out of place. Egyptians in the World Exhibition were meant to be on display, and the visitors were not meant to be themselves people from the regions on display. The Egyptians who saw the exhibit of Egypt were thoroughly disgusted by the representation of their own country, because their country was represented as a place that was dirty, disorganized, backward, and altogether negative in contrast to the modern world of Europe all around in Paris. This is where a place like Egypt fit within the colonial imagination, within the imagination of the colonial powers. It's not how Egyptians saw themselves. Egyptians saw themselves in the mid-late 19th century as a rapidly modernizing country, a little behind Europe, but still far more modern than most of the rest of what would come to be called the Third World. So the exhibitions played a role, first of all, in the simple sense that they provided a whole system of meaning through which citizens of Northern European and North Atlantic countries could make sense of the whole world and their role as dominant imperial powers, could make sense of it, because by portraying the people they were about to rule over as dirty, disorganized, backward, ignorant, the exhibitions made it seem perfectly obvious and perfectly natural that Northern Europeans, North Atlantic populations would be ruling over, as they soon were, the vast majority of the rest of the world.
Mubarak was the one responsible for undermining the strength of alternatives. We have opposition parties such as Al-Wafd or Al-Tajamma, the leftist Tajamma, the rightist Wafd, and the liberals. Mubarak thought it was clever on his part to undermine the strength of these opposition parties, and now we are left with these two bad alternatives, either this corrupt regime or these fascist fundamentalists.
I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that these columns are probably Roman or Byzantine, or some of these columns were even old Egyptian columns. Some of these columns were even old Egyptian columns. And they have been taken freely, like most monuments of this type. They've been taken and sort of integrated into mosques, which would go to prove probably that the sequence, the historical sequence, is not really important. What is important is a sort of continuous stream of a religious experience that gets expressed in monuments, whether Old Egyptian, Coptic, Muslim, Byzantine, and so on.
It was built by Sultan Qaitbay, who was one of the more magnificent of the later Mamluk sultans in the 15th century. And he built 5 mosques all over Cairo, and that was just one of his foundations. But the period when he built it, at that time, Cairo had reached a degree of sophistication. I mean, it was probably by far the largest city in the Mediterranean and Islamic worlds at the time. It was an extremely sophisticated city, and his mosque there and tomb and madrasa or school, it's all forms part of a complex. And it's just one of the most beautiful examples of Mamluk architecture in Cairo.
I try to use the World Exhibition as not just an incident in itself, but as a sort of motif for explaining something about the way modernity itself was organized in the late 19th century. That the World Exhibition exemplifies a way of organizing representations of the world and of people's place in it, that in some ways was a much more general process in colonialism. Exhibitions provided a way of laying out the truth, the meaning of the world, that colonialism itself tried to do on the ground as it expanded across the world. So it had this, exhibitions can be seen as a sort of exemplary process for 19th century Europeans in that respect.
The Mamluk rule in Egypt, which was a dynasty, a sort of slave dynasty, of extraordinary interest because they were actually a slave corps of the Egyptian army who had a coup d'etat and took over and then perpetuated this business of buying young slaves from Circassia, Central Asia, from the Caucasus, bringing them to Egypt and raising them as soldiers. And they perpetuated themselves as a dynasty over 250 years. And by the end of the 15th century, Qaid Bey ruled in the 1470s, 1480s. Cairo is a magnificent city. And of course, that's just predates Columbus discovering America and so on. And Cairo was the center for the spice trade between the East and Europe, and for all the trade between Eastern Europe that came by way of the Red Sea. And it derived enormous wealth from this. Of course, after America was discovered, and of course America was discovered when Columbus was trying to get to the Indies, and very much at the same time that America was discovered, the Portuguese managed to get around Africa to India and have a direct sea route and thereby bypass Cairo. So the sort of the economic backbone of the city was taken away. So after that period, you no longer have this great, magnificent buildings anymore. So it's really the peak and the end of Cairo as a great imperial city.
The World Exhibitions in themselves were seen as a didactic institution. When they were first set up in the 1850s, the great Crystal Palace exhibition in London, many people in Britain in the ruling class were extremely worried about the idea of allowing millions and millions of ordinary citizens, masses, to gather together in a single place. Very fresh in people's minds were the revolutions of 1848, and it was not clear how it would be possible to keep discipline and order among such large masses of people. The organizers were quite sure, because they saw exhibitions as very much a part of a process of creating order, creating discipline through a process of education, through a process of inculcating a certain view of the world and of people's place in the world. That principle of education, that you can organize a vast event or a vast part of the city, in this case the parts of the city that made the World Exhibitions, organize it as an educational project, so that people, by actually being brought into the experience of this exhibit, would have an educational experience, was something that was also practiced on a much larger scale as people began reorganizing, rebuilding the great European capitals in the latter part of the 19th century, Paris being the most famous example. An important principle was that you would create a system of meaning, a system of order, a set of representations that in and of themselves would have an educational and a disciplinary effect upon the population. Now, the way in which the organizers of exhibits in Europe felt about their own populations was paralleled in a country like Egypt. Egypt too had a ruling class. And it's easy to forget that many of the projects of modernity in 19th century Egypt that were later going to be taken up by a colonial power, in many cases initiated by the Egyptian ruling class itself. They came to Egypt, to Europe, and one of the things they wrote about was the enormous discipline and orderliness of the crowd in the European street. They were amazed at what seemed to them the quiet, the order, the civility with which people dealt with one another, and they compared this with what they saw as the clamor and the disorder of the street in Cairo. And beginning particularly in the last third or so of the 19th century, these Egyptian reformers sought to introduce the same kinds of principle of order into the streets, even the homes of Cairo and other cities of Egypt.
I try to sort of mingle these questions with the mundane, the everyday, the day-to-day, down-to-earth reality of the people of now, of here, and so on. But I hope there is a dimension of this religious experience there. I mean, the sacred and the profane would be intermingled and probably linked together organically.
Through literature, do you want?
Through fiction.
Do you want to achieve some kind of immortality, like this building is trying to achieve an immortality in fiction?
Well, let us say that the texts themselves, the works themselves, probably tend to aspire to that sort of immortality, which I imagine is something of an Egyptian, characteristically Egyptian character. After all, the pyramids, the temples, the Coptic churches and the Muslim mosques are all a quest for immortality, a defiance of temporality. They tend to sort of ignore the time dimension and to defy the transience and the temporality of man.
Why the urge to slow things down? Why the urge to make things permanent, inexorable?
It's inexplicable, I think, but it is there, deep down in man, and probably in the soil of Egypt and the soil of the Egyptian soul, if one can use this expression. That quest for immortality and this atemporality, this non-temporality, is still there, and since ages. So probably this is also at the root of all religions, or one of the roots of all religions, whatever they are.
They tended to exaggerate in order to frighten Copts and frighten intellectuals into supporting the regime. But they underestimated it in the fact that they thought that by police measures they can put a stop to their activities, which is quite farcical, because security measures can only aggravate the situation, and with every terroristic action, in comes the Minister of Interior and tells us that, well, the last batch of terrorists have been arrested, or the main core of the fundamentalist movement have been rounded up. And it turns out that it isn't true, and we have been living with this terror for the past 2 years, and it is increasing.
I did write a book called about Rabat, which is the capital of Morocco, the subtitle of which is Urban Apartheid in Morocco. It drove the French crazy. They didn't like the idea of apartheid, but one of the things that I was trying to find out was how it was achieved. And it was achieved through architecture and city planning.
Can you give us an example of exactly how a day-to-day event, an architectural event, was constructed to put apartheid in place and to play into the hands of French imperial expansion into the southern?
Very simple. There was a very simple key, and it was done through law. With the ideology of the Islamic city, the need for privacy, the need for the segregation of females, the protection of females, a law was passed, and this is in the about 1916, that no house may be constructed in the Medina which has any windows on the street. They must all be courtyard houses. Furthermore, in the new French quarters, no wall may be constructed around a house which is higher than shoulder height. I thought that was a very clever system. It sounds very much like the ways of planning and just architecture. But no Moroccan was going to live in a house where the wall around the building could only be shoulder height. And some Frenchmen still wanted to live in houses that didn't have any windows. So they had to pass more laws, and finally did outlaw the construction or the residence of any Europeans in the Moroccan quarter. Now, the ideology was that this was out of respect for the separate cultures. On the other hand, if there was an uprising, having refortified these cities whose walls had fallen down, they could keep the population that might be uprising within the city by closing the gates.
There is such a thing as an Islamic city. There's a distinct phenomenon of the Islamic city. There's a fairly well-defined structure. An Islamic city must have the architecture balancing with the ideas or the ideology of Islam, which is essentially based in the notions of justice, of peace, of space, the notion of the mosque as a center of piety, of prayer, of worship, the notion of justice where citizens have access to food, to the rulers of the land so that their problems are solved. Justice would mean not only for the elite, not only for the corrupt elite as we see in many Muslim countries today, but for the population as a whole. Many of these concepts would be directly wedded to the idea of an Islamic city because poverty and filth and ignorance do not encourage a happy or a healthy society.
Anyone who has seen the battle for Algiers knows the significance of that separation between the Oriental city and the French city. But when the French came to Morocco, you read the documents at the time of the Résidence Générale, and he is always talking about the mistakes that we made in Algeria. We allowed too much of a mingling. And this time, and this is what I mean by the ideology of the Oriental city, this time we will not make a mistake. We will preserve the old ways, and we will keep them separate from the new. Therefore, you can't even evolve as a Moroccan. I mean, in France, you know, in Algeria, you could become an évalué. You could rise, aspire to be a Frenchman. But in Morocco, it's much more exploitative. So what I discovered in the descriptions of the Islamic city was a set of formulae for preserving what they had thought of as the Islamic city. It was a peculiar kind of city. Moroccan cities are not, they're not Aleppo, they are not Jerusalem. They're certainly not the Islamic cities of the Gulf area, which have tall skyscrapers. What you had in Morocco, and particularly in Fez, is a mixture of Spanish and North African, because those were two societies that were quite connected.
Egypt has always been a place where there's been a lot of cross-cultural mixing. And so, you know, what is foreign to Egypt and what is native to Egypt isn't so much a question, I don't think. There are different ways of interpreting Cairo as a city, but Cairo is such an ancient city, and it's been through so many waves of change that it's difficult to get any kind of consolidating view in any case.
So there's no such thing as a foreigner in the city, in a sense?
In a sense, there isn't. In a sense, there isn't. I don't think. I mean, there is a tourist, of course. You know, there are people who come through just to spend a few days in Cairo and go around by bus to museums and so on. But no, I think in terms of a perspective on things, there's always been such a large foreign community in Egypt.
Even from the surrounding Arab world, from Syria?
Yes, yeah. It's always been an entrepot for all kinds of movement across Africa, from east to west.
Does it present a dilemma for you, or is it something that you're quite fluidly aware of?
No, on the contrary, I think it's what makes the city fascinating. I mean, if Cairo were a purely native Egyptian city, it would be far less interesting. And I think it's exactly this cross-cultural exchange that's made Cairo such a fascinating place, and has made it so for such a long time as well.
I may mention here that for many Muslims, Medina, which is the first great city that became Muslim after the Prophet migrated there, is the example of the ideal Muslim city, where in a sense religion and the state are balanced, where people are free to practice their religion, and even those who are not Muslim have access to justice and the law.
The walls of Cairo had essentially been down by the time of the British occupation. The gates, the northern wall, the southern wall, were still in existence. But by the second half of the 19th century, before British occupation, the walls on the east and the west were essentially non-functional. There's a lot of discussion of the difference between French and English colonialism. I've not ever really believed that much in the difference. One of the things that by working both in Cairo and in Rabat, and also in Tunis for a while, because I thought that laws were so important in the laws of planning and architecture and architectural control, I started reading the laws about city building and the control over the kinds of buildings you could put up, the land uses, and it was quite fascinating.
Quaid-e-Azam wanted for Pakistan his ideas on the Pakistani minorities. Now he was very clear. Two examples. Number one, his famous speech in August 1947, I believe one of his most important speeches, in which in the Constituent Assembly he said that once Pakistan is made, we are all free citizens of the state. Hindus and Christians must go to their temples and churches, and Muslims to their mosques. We are all equal citizens of the state. He underlined this. Then his famous statement, there was a riot between Muslims and Hindus, and these are refugees coming from India. They were very upset with what they had seen crossing over into Pakistan. So they saw the Hindus, and a riot developed, and Quaid-e-Azam rushed to the site, and he was very moved with what he saw, this terrible confrontation, and he gave this famous statement. He said, "I would rather be known as the Protector General of the minorities than the Governor General of Pakistan." So he was giving great emphasis to the minorities, acutely aware, I believe, that so many Muslims in turn had become a minority in India. So this was the spirit that Quaid-e-Azam, I believe, had for his Pakistan. Now,
You believe he was earnest entirely?
absolutely, I believe he's absolutely earnest because of his life. I mean, you can only judge a man not so much by the words he says or the texts he writes, but by his life. Throughout his life, his closest friends, his advisors, many of them were non-Muslim. As you know, his great hero, the man he really looked up to, was Gokhale, the Hindu, famous Hindu name in Bombay. Right up to the end, his personal doctor, the only doctor who knew the greatest secret in India, which is that he was dying, was Dr. Patel, again a non-Muslim. After Pakistan, his personal staff consisted of Christians, as his ADCs, military secretaries, governors, and so on. So I genuinely believe that he was a very tolerant and a very broad-minded man.
The Egyptian Copts tend to be very passive indeed. They leave it to the government to do the job. They leave it to Muslim intellectuals to defend their rights. No, you do it. It's better that you should do this or that. It is, I mean, in the press campaign against Islamic terror, hardly any Copt contributed to it. For fear of being assassinated, for fear of being accused of such sentiments for their own interests, etc. So they think it is better to leave it to Muslim intellectuals, enlightened, who can defend their case. I don't think this is right. I think Copts should actively participate in such a campaign against fundamentalism and terror.
In the context of cities being built for war, the City of the Dead is a sort of city of peace because it was built just outside the fortified walls of Cairo. I mean, Cairo was a city that had been invaded many times. And one of the names for Cairo is Al-Qahira al-Mahrusa, or the well-guarded city. And it always had terrific fortifications. And the City of the Dead was built just outside the fortifications as a sort of zone that would be not only outside the military walls, but outside in a sense, spiritually outside the bustle of the city, outside commerce.
There are murders every day in Upper Egypt, burning up of churches or shops owned by Copts, etc. A doctor walking down the street is assassinated for the mere fact that he is a Copt. The Copts are not retaliating, simply not retaliating.
How is it being depicted in the official media?
Well, when such actions started to occur, the government was really pleased at it because this, as I said before, would secure the support of the Copts for the regime. The government pretended to be taking measures against the assassins or the people who burnt shops and churches or killed policemen standing on guard outside churches, etc. And it is very, very unfortunate that the government did not decide on a confrontation with the fundamentalists until tourists began to be assassinated, etc. When foreign investment was threatened, the main source of foreign currency for the state was threatened, tourism. It was only then that the government thought of taking real harsh measures against terrorism and fundamentalism.
One law governs the taking of land from native owners. And I want to talk a little bit about that because although this is not an architectural law, it is the chief mechanism of colonialism, and it was the chief mechanism for Jewish settlement in Palestine. The same laws. The means of alienating ownership from the people who had always used the land to foreign ownership. And I traced from country to country to country, and I translated back and forth from French to English, etc., and traced it to the laws that the British had used in Australia. You survey the land, you ask people for the titles to the land. In societies that don't have titles to land, this went on throughout the Middle East, went on through much of Africa as well, in which you alienate the best farmland from the people who have been farming it for thousands of years, and create a title which now becomes a commodity, which can be sold and bought, and which can be used by the colonial settlers to remove population. Now, what's the difference between the Islamic city and the kinds of cities we have in the Middle East now? The kinds of cities we have in the Middle East now are largely peasants whose land was alienated during that period. So that although there was this ideology that there's an Islamic city, described by the Orientalist, it has a bazaar, it has these kinds of trades, it has these doors and gateways, but the ownership of the land is alienated, particularly in the countryside. The Medina's crowd with population thrown off the land, there is no room for them, so that by the time you get the Orientalist description of what a medieval Islamic city was like, it is already filled with peasants whose land has been taken away from them.
Cairo first developed in recent years as a city.
Is alienated, particularly in the countryside. The Medina's crowd with population thrown off the land, there is no room for them, so that by the time you get the Orientalist description of what a medieval Islamic city was like, it is already filled with peasants whose land has been taken away from them.
Cairo first developed in recent years as a city. There have been so many stages of Cairo's history, and even so many different Cairos, that it becomes terrifically complicated. I mean, in Pharaonic times, there were two cities that were more or less in the region of where Cairo is now. They fell into decay, and Cairo, as we know it, really built up after the Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. And Cairo began at that time as at that time, to go back a little bit, it was Alexandria, which had been the Greek capital of Egypt. When the Arabs invaded Egypt, they sort of abandoned Alexandria and used Cairo as their center for military control of the country. And of course, it was a perfect location right at the base of the Nile Delta, controlling all movement north and south, and also close to the Red Sea, so that all the traffic to Arabia came through Cairo. And Cairo started at that stage as an Arab encampment. And eventually it was walled in. And as dynasties changed, the walls became more and more impressive. And there were later developments when Egypt was invaded by another dynasty a few hundred years later, the Fatimid dynasty, who came in from Tunisia. They built a completely separate city north of the previous urban center of Cairo, which is what they called for the first time El-Qahira, or what we take the word Cairo from. That's actually, the word comes from a much later development, which is in the 10th century. And this all gets very complicated. But when they built El-Qahira, it was as a walled imperial city, rather like the imperial city in Peking.
The dispossession of peasants from the land really is the initial stage, but it's followed very shortly thereafter by the laws of city planning. I was quite fascinated because everyone said, oh, the origin of those laws of segregation are really French. And yet what I found out is that they were British laws that were instituted in Egypt first and then nicely translated over.
To my mind, the Egyptian mind, and to some extent the Arabic mind as well, or the Arab mind, is nurtured on the grandiose, on the epic, on the supra-mundane dimension, which that is a relationship between the pharaonic monuments and Egyptian. They are grand. And you can see that in the walls of mosques. They remind you very powerfully of the walls of old pharaonic temples. Now, this is in contrast to the ornate nature of say, Persian mosques or Indian mosques, Far Eastern
This
mosques.
particular
This, here it is bare, it is strict, it is austere. There it is rather ornamental and, you know, as I said, ornate. Now, this austere aspect is specifically pharaonic and old Egyptian, in contrast to the ancient Greek temples and monuments and so on, which are built to the measure of the human, the golden means principle. Even the gods of the ancient Greeks are too human, too much. Again, this is in contrast to the pharaonic gods or to the almighty God of Islam. What I mean is the grand dimension, the suprahuman dimension of these monuments, which again probably can be explained in terms of this quest of immortality, of defeating temporality.
From the middle latter part of the 19th century, one suddenly finds both Egyptians and foreigners writing about existing systems of schooling as beset by problems of disorder and disorganization. They would describe in particular the famous teaching mosque of Al-Azhar, which had been established more than 1,000 years before and had been continuously in operation in the heart of Cairo. And the descriptions of the late 19th century suddenly see Al-Azhar as a messy, disorganized, disruptive place. They describe how it works or it doesn't work. The interior courtyard of the mosque is the scene of the teaching. Each teacher, each professor simply selects a pillar at which he is going to deliver his lectures, and students gather around in a circle and listen, or they don't, they come, they go. So many people are teaching at the same time in the same courtyard, and to the observer who enters the mosque and looks at this, it looks like a scene of total disorder. One of the things I've tried to argue in colonizing Egypt is that this appearance of total disorder is really a product of seeing the world in terms of the new principles of order embodied in the architecture of the new schoolings, but also more broadly in the architecture of the cities and other places in which a new, very spatial form of order was introduced. What I argue is that the apparent disorder, what it seems visually, to the visual observer, very disorganized experience of the teaching mosque, the old teaching mosque in Cairo, was simply a different kind of order, was order that worked according to a different set of principles. Our own principles of order, those that have organized us since the 19th century, that is to say our modern principles of order, work very much according to a spatial principle. They work by laying out a grid, a plan, a framework in space, and then trying to organize activities to fit within that space. Laying out a set of separate rooms as classrooms, setting out desks in neat rows, and then organizing people within that space. So to keep with the example of education, lining up students in rows in desks, putting teachers in a defined place at the head of the classroom, usually standing on a little platform. Similar kinds of organizing of space in other sort of non-spatial forms. You think of the curriculum and the timetable, enormous concern with the laying out of time in a spatial pattern, dividing up the day into a certain fixed number of boxes of hours and minutes, and then filling each of those boxes with a particular subject, so that the principal order is that of the grid or the framework, which is laid out as a sort of architecture, and then finding the activities, the lessons, the pupils, the people who are to fit within those spaces.
Islam itself is very clear about minorities. There is a duty of the state to protect them and to allow them free worship of their own religion. This is very clear, and by and large, Muslim societies have maintained this throughout history. I believe that Islam probably has the best record for minorities throughout history. The famous example, of course, is the Ottoman Empire. When the Muslims and Jews were expelled from Spain, many of the Jews migrated to the Ottoman Empire and lived very happily in Constantinople. But the situation in Pakistan is an unhappy one, because not only is what is happening un-Islamic, which is the persecution in some cases of the Christians, but also because of the local situation of society itself. The Christians have been, by and large, fairly well integrated in Pakistan. I know many Christians in Punjab, for instance, who only speak Punjabi, who've taken Christian names. For instance, my friend James Shera of Rugby, now he's a Christian Pakistani. He's very proud to be a Pakistani, very conscious of it. His second name is Shera, which means lion. So, you know, it could be the name of a Muslim or a Christian, in his case a Christian. So I believe that Pakistan itself must restore the sense of tolerance, of understanding, and of providing security to the minorities. If it cannot do so, then morally it cannot blame or accuse India of not in turn providing security to the minorities of India, largely Muslims. I mean, there are over 100 million Muslims in India. And Pakistanis are very often agitated or concerned about these minorities. So Pakistan really has to set its own house in order.
Forces that might have generated things that we've come to recognize in a variety of Muslim cities. What would generate them? And I've suggested that the prescriptions on modesty and gender segregation have a limited number of architectural solutions. The main problem is to guard visual access. And when you are thinking about a gender segregation that's based on visuals, as you can hear, it's perfectly all right to hear female voices. It's not proper to see people who are not related to you, which suggests that the problem is either to cover the person or to create spaces that that shield vision. One thing that you will find in every Islamic city is the bent doorway.
The bent doorway.
The bent doorway. When a door opens to the street, in this house we can open the door and we can see directly into the house, which means that any woman working in the kitchen can be seen. A bent doorway is a very simple device, so that as you come in, you are faced with a blank wall and you must take a turn. Now, that's an architectural solution which guards the privacy of the house. And there are Islamic traditions of building guarded by law, and this is Islamic law. You may not build a house that is considerably taller than your neighbor, because then you would be above them and would have visual access to their open space. If you have a house where you might possibly overlook the courtyard of the next house, you may not have a window, or you must have a window so high up that it lets light in, but that you can't see out of it. Now, all of these I consider parts of the repertoire that all Islamic architecture must address, but they address it differently in different places. Another characteristic of Islamic cities, and I think this is almost anywhere they are, is the creation of an intermediate space which is neither private nor fully public. The intermediate space, which is quite fascinating, because males don't even know it exists, is the space that women occupied, and I'm using past tense, because I am not describing either a medieval Middle Eastern city, nor am I describing a city of today. But I'm talking about the architectural ideal if you wanted to segregate the genders by visually. The semi-private space, which of course disappears the minute that a male enters because the females exit, is the space that fairly intimate members of the family and intimate neighbors can occupy when no strangers are present.
The building of walls does have a great deal to do with the shape of Cairo. But of course, after the end of the medieval period, walls were no longer important. When Egypt was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in the early 16th century, it became part of a vast empire, and the borders were extended so far away that Cairo was no longer under any kind of military threat. So it's been some time since its role as a fortress has been important.
One of the things that was going on in 19th century Egypt was the construction of a national history, a history of Egypt going back to pharaonic times. And of course, it was Europeans who first started systematically exploring that pharaonic history. And it was through a number of different European authors that Egyptian nationalist writers themselves first became interested in that history and first discovered that history. Let me say two things about the way that, or what was involved in that process. The first thing that was involved was the creation of Egypt itself as an object. Because the place we call today Egypt has such a long history, going back many thousands of years, we tend to assume that there's always been as it were, a nation, a country called Egypt. and in some sense what one sees today marked on the map by a set of lines distinguishing it from another place called Sudan to the south, another place called Libya to the west, and so on, is that somehow that object has always been there on maps ever since. That's not so in the specific sense that that identity of that particular geographic region was something that had to be constructed as such in the 19th century as part of the business, as everywhere. I mean, the same thing was going on in England, creating a sense of English national identity in other parts of Europe, creating a sense of Egypt as a singular identity stretching back over thousands of years. Again, if one can sort of get the novelty of that, prior to the 19th century, for 300 years or so, and even through the 19th century, Cairo was governed as part of the Ottoman Empire. Cairo, and the province of Cairo, as it was called, of Masr, did not necessarily correspond to the object we call today Egypt. In much of the 18th century, large areas of the south were independent of Cairo, and indeed large areas of the delta in the north were also independent of Cairo. And it was only in the 19th century that this idea was created of Egypt as a distinct entity, going back, having a continuous history. Back to Pharaonic times. Now, that's not to say that people before that were ignorant of themselves or ignorant of their situation. It's just that they situated themselves differently. They would have situated themselves much more in a broader Islamic history. They would have situated themselves perhaps much more in local histories of particular cities or particular towns or villages, and other kinds of communal pasts. It's only in the 19th century one gets the idea that one's overriding identity is tied up with this thing called a nation-state, whether one's nation-state is France or Canada or Egypt. Now, the first texts to be translated by Egyptians were European texts, creating this sense of Egypt as a unified political object stretching back through thousands of years to Pharaonic and even prehistoric times. Much of that European literature was written inevitably from a very European, which in those days meant, probably still does mean, a very racist, a very colonialist point of view. One of the most popular authors, popular historians translated in the 19th century by Egyptians was a Frenchman by the name of Gustave Le Bon, whose writings today would appear so racist that they could not be published or used in schools, yet at the turn of the century he was one of the most popular writers both in Europe and in the Middle East. Most of his books were translated into Arabic. He had a very clear sense of racial hierarchies, that there was a system of evolution that had produced a series of races with Africans somewhere on the bottom, and needless to say, Caucasians at the top, and that history, including the history of Egypt, was the history of racial evolution towards greater and greater racial intelligence and purity. And this was the kind of stuff being translated back into Arabic by some of these 19th century Egyptian reformers. Not all of them. There were some who objected to this, but in many ways Egypt's national history was first created by people, by a ruling elite that saw in these very racist European texts a way to construct in Arabic their own history. Now, part of the reason that they saw this as useful is because there was always a kind of message in this racism, which was a message about the difference between a ruling elite and the masses. In all races, even the more backward ones, as they were called, there was a difference between the ruling elite and the masses. A racial difference, a difference in people's genes, which explained the superiority and the right to rule of that elite. And of course, for an Egyptian ruling class, there was something that appealed in that kind of literature, even if they had to put up with ideas about innate European superiority that they were not so comfortable with.